Super Bowl.
I hope that made the start of the podcast. Greg Cosell. Greg, I'm gonna trick you into a sports talk radio Super Bowl prediction if you're not careful. You never know when the mic's going to go on.
Houston Texans going to the Super Bowl, Buck,
I love to see it. Listen, yeah. I'm rooting for Davis Mills, man. And just that organization. It's been down bad for a little while and, in the headlines for the wrong reasons, but we're not here to talk about that today. We're here to talk about what the Houston Texans have done to try and get a little more competitive in the AFC South and what Lovie Smith as a not new head coach, but a new to them head coach is kind of up against this year. Greg, what did you, I know that the David Culley thing was short-lived, obviously, and that it was a weird year across the board for them. But what was your general takeaway from the Houston Texans last season?
Well, I think the number one thing when you think of the Texans is what Davis Mills did.
Yeah.
Because Davis Mills was a third-round pick. And, at the time of the draft, we had no idea about Deshaun Watson. I'm going back now to the draft when they took Mills.
Yeah.
So, Mills, they started with Tyrod Taylor, and Mills became the quarterback. And I thought Mills clearly improved as the season went on, ending with a really good game, the final game of the season, which I believe was against Tennessee.
That's right. It was a hell of a third quarter. He gave him all kinds of fits.
Yeah, I thought Davis Mills clearly improved. He's one of the things that stood out when I watched him at Stanford, he only had, I think, 13 starts or something like that,
right.
Some very small number at Stanford because he got hurt and then they had the COVID year.
Mm-hmm.
And Mills wore that big knee brace in college. And there was a big concern about whether, hey, can this guy move at all because you wear that knee brace and you don't move very well.
Right.
And then, of course, last year, he did not wear a knee brace. His knee was obviously better. Now, he's never going to be a dynamic playmaker, but he's not immobile. He's not a statue, but he throws a beautiful ball. He looks the part. He plays with length and size. Even though he's not 6'5" or 6'6", he looks big in the pocket. When he came out of the Atlanta area, he was the number one pro-style quarterback as a recruit in the country. And I believe he committed to Stanford early, so the SEC schools did not really go after him. But he throws the ball really well. I think there's a certain poise and composure to him. I mean, the other game that stood out to me, which was very early in his career, was when they played New England.
Yeah.
And Bill Belichick normally gives young rookie quarterbacks a lot of problems. And while New England came back to win that game with their own rookie quarterback, Davis Mills played very well against New England. And that was early in the season, so early in his career. So I think you have to start with Davis Mills, and I would expect him to take a step forward this year.
Well, he's going to work with Pep Hamilton as the offensive coordinator, and Lovie Smith, obviously, with a defensive background as the new head coach. Their draft, Greg, in going back and looking over it ahead of our podcast today, it's easy to say in June that you like somebody's draft before you see how these players pan out. But I forgot how much I liked the Texans draft, not just because of what they did and how much draft capital that they did have, but with the third overall pick, Derek Stingley Jr., who I think most people regarded as the best corner coming out. Kenyon Green, the offensive guard at Texas A&M, who we talked a lot about for the Tennessee Titans, a couple of interesting prospects on down the line. But as far as the offense and Pep Hamilton is concerned, the league is very familiar with Pep Hamilton. And hell, the AFC South is familiar with Pep Hamilton. Well, what kind of would the approach be with working with a quarterback like Davis Mills?
Well, let's look at the talent first, because this is an offense that actually has some talent. It's been so easy to talk negatively about the Texans, because they've been not very good for a number of years. But we just talked about Mills. A player they drafted, I believe in the fourth round, was running back Dameon Pierce.
That's right, out of Florida.
And Pierce, I kept going back and forth with in my evaluation, but I ultimately liked him. And it would not surprise me if he ends up being their starting back. He's a physical runner. He's a take no prisoners runner. He's a finisher. So he's a sustaining back. He gets hard yards. And you always want that with your back. You always want the kind of back that when it's blocked for 3 gets 6. That really is what determines backs. In this league, with very few exceptions, you don't see 60-yard touchdown runs. That's not how you evaluate a back. You evaluate a back, particularly if he's going to be a foundation back, meaning he's going to carry, let's say, 16 to 20 times every week. Those backs have to get hard yards. And I think Dameon Pierce fits that category. But when you look at their receiving core, they brought back Brandon Cooks. They have Nico Collins, who was a third-round pick a year ago, and he's an important piece here, and we don't know exactly what he is just yet, other than he's long, he's athletic, and he can run. Yeah. And they would certainly love him to be the vertical dimension, because they drafted John Mechie in the second round, a player whose tape I really, really liked coming out of Alabama. I watched him in his last 2 years at Alabama, and I think Mechie's just going to be one of those really solid pros. Not necessarily an explosive guy. He's not going to run by people per se. The player I compared him to going back to last summer when I watched his 2020 tape is a player now on the Titans, Robert Woods. I think John Mechie is very similar to Robert Woods in the way in which he plays, his physical traits, his approach to the game. He will block, as we know Robert Woods will. So I think their receiving core is pretty interesting. And all Brandon Cooks seems to do is gain 1,000 yards every year.
You forget how good a season he had. He didn't, just from my frame of reference, he didn't have statistically big outings against the Titans. The first game here was a slog. The weather was terrible. And Tyrod Taylor, I don't think he threw a pass further than 5 yards.
Right. I remember that game. Yeah.
It was, and by nature of Ryan Tannehill's 4 interceptions, that game was lost, but still. Brandon Cooks, it's easy to forget that he's only 28 years old because he's been in so many different spots across his young career, and still, like you said, Greg, a hugely productive player despite varying circumstances.
I think people would be surprised that he's played 8 years in the league, and in 6 of those years he's gained 1,000 yards receiving.
Yeah,
I don't think people think of Brandon Cooks that way, but he's just a good player. So they have Brandon, and we talked about Mechie. Now the O-line, of course, has been an issue in recent years, but obviously they get Tunsil back. Mm-hmm. They like Titus Howard at right tackle. He was a first-round pick in 2019. You mentioned Kenyon Green. They'll plug him in at left guard. Justin Britt is a quality starting center in this league. Right guard, they signed A.J. Cann, who did not become the player many thought he would when he was in Jacksonville. So right guard might be open for competition. We don't know that. But this is not a bad O-line. And I think the tight end position, I really liked Brevin Jordan coming out of the University of Miami. He's not as lengthy as you would like, but he's a very, very good receiver. And it's my understanding that one reason he was a 5th-round pick is there were some off-the-field concerns. I don't know those things, so I can't speak to that. But I think that he's a very good receiving prospect going into his second year. He's very athletic. You can split him out wide as well. So, and they can also play with a fullback. They have Andy Janovich, who's been a fullback in this league for a while and has played well in that role. So they can line up in different ways. This is an offense, I think, that's trending up. Whatever that means as we speak today, in the middle of June, that's, as you said when we started, that's hard to say right now. But I think this is an offense that is looking more positively than negatively. And maybe in the past couple of years, we might not have said that about this offense.
No, it's been kind of the case. I mean, the team that we talked about last week too, Greg, the Jacksonville Jaguars, they're 2 of the more interesting kind of like case studies in the NFL this year. I think if you're just somebody who's paying attention to the moves that they've made and, just basically how to get back to football competency. Now they have a veteran coaching staff, and Lovie Smith will obviously, I don't know if Lovie Smith is handling defensive play calls.
He's listed as the D coordinator, so we'll see. And it's funny you mention that, and then we'll get into some of their defensive players. But last year they started out playing a high percentage of cover 2, because that's Lovie's thing. He may be the remaining cover 2 coach in the NFL, from years and years back. But what they found out is they were getting their burned. So Lovie started to play a lot more single high and more man coverage as the year progressed. So you would have to assume they'd continue to move in that direction. particularly with the drafting of Derek Stingley, who's potentially a high-level man-to-man corner.
Yes, and that's something that I think is going to be interesting to watch, because you look at the rest of the collection of talent that they have on defense, Greg, and I think generally getting to the quarterback is something that you want your defense to do anyway. Ross Blacklock, as a younger player at a TCU a couple of years ago, along that defensive front. They added Jerry Hughes this offseason, who's obviously getting up there in age. The kind of defensive step that I think would basically Lovie Smith doesn't think his defense is good enough, and I think their draft was pretty indicative of that.
Yeah, and also, Jerry Hughes they signed Mario Addison, also from Buffalo.
Yeah.
Rasheem Green from Seattle, who had some moments in Seattle. I think was initially maybe a third-round pick, if memory serves me correctly. So they're trying to sort of patch together a pass rush, because Lovey's not a high percentage blitzer. He does not want to do that. Now, if you can't rush the quarterback with 4, Buck, at some point you have to rush with more than 4, because you have to speed up the quarterback.
Right.
It's not always about sacks. You have to speed up the quarterback. You have to make him feel uncomfortable. You have to make him play faster than he wants to. So we'll see how it plays out. I think Jonathan Grenard had a nice year for them a year ago. He looks like a rising type player, but beyond him, we don't know. And that's the biggest concern with this defense. And you hit it right on the head. Can they rush the quarterback? I think they've improved, though, in the second level. I think Kirksey is a solid pro. Grugier Hill was having a nice year last year, missed some time. I personally really like Christian Harris out of Alabama. I was surprised he lasted until the 3rd round. I think he could be a day one starter. We'll see. Look, he was a day one starter for Nick Saban after never playing linebacker in high school. So there's something about Christian Harris that obviously his ability to assimilate information at a high level, because you don't start for Nick Saban day one at linebacker, having never played the position, if he doesn't think you can play the position well. So I like Harris. Obviously, they drafted Stingley. They drafted Jalen Petrie from Baylor.
Yeah.
Who I'm sure they have penciled in as a safety. I'm very, very curious how that works, because he was kind of a multi-dimensional, phenomenal college player who I couldn't quite figure out what he would be in the NFL. Now, I could be dead wrong on this. Obviously he made a ton of plays in college.
Right.
He played slot corner. He did not play a lot at safety, believe it or not. He rushed the quarterback off the edge. He basically played stacked linebacker. They have him as a safety. That's why they drafted him. He's supposed to be an incredibly smart kid who picks things up. Maybe he'll end up being a really good safety, but to me, that's a little bit of a projection right now.
Yeah, and they'll have the opportunity to kind of, figure out exactly what they want that role for him to be over the course of this season. Now, it's a pretty interesting early stretch, just kind of looking at their first month, Greg. They've got the Colts at home. They're at Denver, at Chicago, and they wrap up the month of September hosting the Los Angeles Chargers. So there's some pretty interesting quarterbacks. Matt Ryan's first game against the Houston Texans as a Colts quarterback, and of course, Russell Wilson and Justin Herbert, Justin Fields. It's going to be a pretty interesting test for Lovie Smith's group.
Without question. And look, I'm not suggesting they're going to go 12-5 and they're going to be in the playoffs, but I just think that this team, particularly on offense, could be a little better than people might think. And obviously it always depends on the quarterback. But I think based on what you saw a year ago with Davis Mills, Buck, I would think you'd have to say that he's not a bad player, and he's getting better. And, quite frankly, there was times last year when I thought he played better than Mac Jones. Now, I'm not going to sit here and make an apples to apples comparison. That doesn't matter, but I think Davis Mills can be a quality starting quarterback in this league.
I would hate for you to get aggregated on something like that, Greg, because I hate that we just can't say statements like that.
No,
in passing, and it have to be, well, what are you doing comparing one player to the other? That kind of stuff drives me crazy.
Yeah, so I'm, you know me well enough to know that I don't really like to do that anyway because I don't think
No.
it's really that relevant. I know people like that, but that's not really relevant. I think Davis Mills is, I've talked to some scouting friends of mine. I don't think anybody is sitting here saying Davis Mills is going to be a top 5 quarterback in the league. I don't think anybody's saying that, but I think Davis Mills can be a quality starter with a pretty good upside. He throws the ball well and he's got some movement. Now, I don't think he's a playmaking type quarterback. You're never going to be talking about Davis Mills in the Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes mold, but that's okay. There's not that many of those guys, you know. But I think you can line up and play with Davis Mills and he can run your offense, particularly if they can develop some kind of running game and they've got some weapons and the O-line should be meaningfully better.
Yeah, it's going to be fun to watch, I think. I've talked to a couple of coaches that have, they're not outwardly going to trash a guy like Davis Mills, but they seem to legitimately have respect for the kind of player that he could potentially be.
No question.
For a team like the Texans. And I think that's all that he needs to be right now as they kind of look to get back on their feet. Next week, Greg, we'll talk about the Indianapolis Colts. That's a situation that seems to have a revolving door at quarterback in ways that I think Colts fans got them a little hot and bothered after
they obviously feel pretty good right now. And, they still have a pretty good roster, although I saw today that Kerry Willis, their safety, retired. He's going to join the ministry, played 3 years in the NFL, and he believes, that he has a higher calling. More power to him.
Yeah,
that stuff's awesome. But that obviously leaves a hole in their secondary because he's a starter.
Yeah, that's a significant headline. I missed that today.
Yeah.
So we'll get into the implications of all the new moves for the Colts and what they kind of look to try and do in the AFC South next week, Greg. I appreciate the time.
Sounds good, Buck. Appreciate it.